Okay, so why don't we get started? And again, I'd like to thank everybody for our second installment of the Knowledge Burst webinar series. Today, we're going to be focused on security and really taking a look at best practices in security, particularly with if you have any data running in a cloud and or processing or handling any type of sensitive information or healthcare related information in any way. And we have two what I believe of the foremost experts in this field joining us on our webinar series today. The first is my co-founder, Brian Jackson. Brian and I have worked together for quite some time, and I'd like to always brag about Brian and his security skills. He's been a cybersecurity professional for over 20 years. He's worked for several Fortune 100 companies in the finance, transportation, fintech, healthcare, as well as the Department of Defense. He also oversees all our cloud operations and security operations here at BurstIQ. Has performed a number of red team assessments across all these industries over the years and has multiple publications on cloud infrastructure and security. Joining him today is Dallas Haselhorst. Dallas, again, I mean, just a solid background, 20 years of IT and cybersecurity experience. Dallas has a master's degree in information security engineering from the SANS Technology Institute. Dallas is also GSC number 231. And if you don't know what that means, GSC is the GIAC, or it's a SANS Institute certification, but it's a GIAC security expert. And there's less than 500 of these individuals in the world, and Dallas happens to be one of them. Dallas is also the organizer of B-Sides KC, and he's worked in and out of healthcare throughout his career. And he's a member of the Cyber Health Working Group and the FBI InfraGard. So welcome, Dallas. I'm happy you're able to join us. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over the webinar to Brian and let Brian walk us through all this wonderful information we have teed up for you today.
Great, thanks, Frank. And thanks everyone for joining. And very happy to do this for everyone. So let's get kind of started. As Frank kind of said, this is a little bit tailored to more of the healthcare specific security, but pretty much all the information that we're going to give can be pertinent across any type of industry. So let's talk a little bit about data and what the value of data is. I mean, just in the last few years, data has become basically the new oil. Data is the most valuable resource on the planet, and which obviously makes cybersecurity very important. But in the same sense, data is very siloed. So meaning that people tend to take the data, put it in their individual silos, and not like to share the data, and which makes it very, very difficult to access and share, as well as it makes it very, very valuable for people to try to hack or obtain this information. So let's talk a little bit about healthcare data specifically. It used to be where data, we didn't have enough data, and over the years we've actually kind of hit the threshold where we actually have too much data, too much healthcare data. And what does that mean? From the devices to the omics to just your normal EMR type of data, we've almost came to the point where, or we actually have came to a point where we have too much data, and trying to disseminate that data in a secure and meaningful way is becoming very, very, very difficult. As I said, sharing it. So, I mean, there is so much pertinent healthcare information out there that could serve so many others, but because of some of the controls and policies of healthcare, it makes data sharing very difficult in today's world. And then healthcare data is very, very special in the sense that it's co-owned, and it could be multiple owned, whereas a lot of data may be owned by an individual or an organization and such. Healthcare data could be owned by you, it could be owned by your doctor, it could be owned by the organization, it could be owned by the state. So there's multiple areas where healthcare data can be owned. So how do you preserve the rights of that data when it's owned by or co-owned by multiple individuals? So another issue with healthcare data as far as trying to secure it. So now we're going to get into kind of my, recommendations and some of the trials and tribulations, as Frank said, over the past 20 years of going into organizations. And a lot of the red flags are issues that we come about when doing security assessments or implementation. So the first one we're going to talk about is basically the plan and design. This is one of the biggest issues we see, and almost probably one of the number one issues we see. Typically, companies will fall into, in my opinion, when they have issues, one of two categories. The first is they didn't design or plan for enterprise growth. They really came up with a plan. Security was kind of at the end, and it wasn't even really thought of. The group or project or company eventually grows to a point where change is just too big of a task, and basically companies then they just kind of try plugging the leaks, and just trying to fix the known stuff, which only accounts for a small amount of issues, and they just never estimated that the company would grow to the size or into the scale that they thought they would. So huge recommendation from me would be you can start small, but plan for really big. So take it in stages and keep it simple, but plan for the future of growth, because you never know where you're going to be. So the other category that we typically see is where companies really overcomplicate their security. They make it so counterproductive for users that it's just there's just so many steps in place that make it so complicated for users. People in general are very smart and resourceful. So people are going to find ways to bypass your internal security. So when you implement all of these safeguards and security mechanisms in place internally, you may be protecting the outside, but you got your internal people that do all sorts of stuff. So that's always a huge thing. So being able to work with your employees and not overcomplicating the process is a huge thing. Making assumptions. So, another big thing for people is, everyone make an assumption that you're not a target. Everyone is a target, and especially in healthcare. Healthcare data is probably one of the most valuable of all data out there. I mean, depending on who you talk to, it could be anywhere from 5 to 15 times, the value of any other data. So, healthcare data is valuable for a number of senses because, it's personal information. It contains a lot of your information, whether it's your social security number, your address. I mean, all the different stuff for being able to do, hacks or identity theft, as well as all the personal information. In the financial side, if you lose your credit card or lose your bank account, you can go get a new bank account number. You can go get a credit card number. In the healthcare sense, you can't go get a new healthcare record. I mean, once you have a certain condition or a disease, that doesn't go away. I mean, that's always going to be part of your health, and that's not something that you can go do. Another one is, talking about the healthcare data. So another one is just kind of continuously testing. That's something that you just constantly have to do. And thinking that you're 100% secure is another, huge assumption that people make. I mean, you may be secure today, but there's always going to be the next vulnerability of tomorrow. And you've always just have to be in a continuous sense of testing and making sure that, something else hasn't came up, as well as, looking at what your employees are doing. For anyone that thinks that, employees aren't doing shadow IT, which is, putting data out in certain instances where, whether it's creating their own Amazon account or putting stuff on their laptop or all sorts of things, it's always evolving and happening. And for people to believe that, we don't have that in our organizations you're kind of, you're not being honest with yourself. So trying to work with that. So I know Dallas will talk about this one a little bit more in a few slides because he's big into this. But security training, I mean, this is a huge thing for organizations. It's an ongoing task, and and things have evolved. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been into some of these security trainings, and it looks like they've put together the security training decks that look like they were created in 2000 or the 1990s, and those things haven't changed. I mean, the different vulnerabilities and guards of today have definitely evolved over the last 20 years. And we can't continue to, just do the same things that we did 20, 30 years ago. Security in general has changed quite a bit. The technologies that we've used has changed, vastly, as well as, how people are collecting the information. It's, the social engineering that hackers do today is a lot more involved and a lot more simple than trying to just go straight through the front door of a lot of enterprise systems. So keeping your employees up to date and going through that is a huge thing. And the last one is like talked about, the employee environment. And what I kind of talked about is, work with your employees. So the security teams really need to work. I mean, the old, it's my way or the highway type of security implementation is basically a straight way to get, basically get your insider threats or your internal teams to basically bypass all your safeguards. As I said, people are very, very smart of how inefficient of how to get their jobs done. And then you have the advent of the cell phone in the last 10 years, where now you're adding all sorts of issues that that didn't exist years ago. You can have a wireless hotspot. You have email on you have your own little computer that's that people carry around in their pocket, and it's a lot of times it's a personal device that is not controlled by an organization. So that brings up all sorts of issues as well. So we're really working with your employees, working and understanding the requirements. It's a give-take relationship. You have to do your best effort to move forward to secure the environment, but you also have to work with people. And again, talking about the shadow IT of, if you make something so difficult that it's an employee, it's just so much easier to go create a shadow environment, say on Amazon AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, copy data over to that environment, and then I can get my job done. They've basically bypassed all of your safeguards in place. I can't tell you how many times you see in the paper or in the news where you see like the NSA or the CIA or whatever, they've put in billions of dollars of systems in place to prevent, intrusions. And then you'll have some, employee that will use a out-of-date laptop that stores sensitive data on it, and that laptop gets hacked when they take it out of the institution. So again, it's making things work with the customer or work with the organization. So now we're going to go into a little bit of the compliance and standards. This is going to pertain a lot more to the healthcare, but the one thing I'll definitely recommend is each different kind of organizations, whether it's whether it's a payer, a provider, an HIE, a private company, each industry has different regulations and compliance. I mean, there are certain HIPAA and other type of regulations that kind of fall over all of them, but each one has to kind of also has individual compliance and regulations for each independent industry. So thinking that maybe you've covered everything is not necessarily meaning that you've covered all of them. Just something to keep in mind. So going into standards, I haven't listed a lot, but I've listed a lot of the big ones. Whether from NIST is a big one. I'm going to go into a little bit more of that, and going into the traditional SOC, the SSA 18 or 18 SOC 2 Type 2 certification. So here at BurstIQ, we go through that yearly. That's a big thing for us to go through that. I think we're in our 4th year of going through that process. And it's a fairly intuitive process, but it's a good thing for every company to go through. Definitely makes Going through audits and such with different organizations is a lot simpler whenever you were able to produce that report that shows that you're following the rules and regulations. And then going into the health, HIPAA and high trust. I mean, obviously those HIPAA is the big one. High trust is becoming a little bit more prevalent. And then finance, PCI is obviously a big one with credit cards and GLBA. Government, talking about STIGs. I know this is a little bit different out of the boundary, but I definitely mentioned this. The STIGs from past work in the Department of Defense, they have STIGs or guidelines for basically every component or infrastructure or system that you could ever contemplate. And it's something that I recommend people look at if you're following a lot of those rules, and they give a lot of good documentation as far as how you build out systems and how you do controls. Obviously, if you're in the DoD systems, those are required to do step by step, but following a lot of those guidelines in the commercial side could definitely make yourself very secure as well. And then a couple of the others that we can talk about. So NIST is a big one. So this is pretty much from a BurstIQ's perspective. We've followed this, basically this guideline from day one. There's a lot of regulations out there, a lot of different, compliance and standards out there, whether it's ISO, NIST, and NIST is there's a lot of different NIST frameworks. So, I mean, it stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it's not just for cybersecurity. So NIST comes up with, energy, health, public safety, but this is basically the cybersecurity segment of NIST. And, we've pretty much followed this from day one. And it seems like over the last 20 years, all the different rules and regulations, standards, compliance have slowly, at least in my opinion, have started migrating towards a lot of these standards. So, if you follow this kind of basically standards and compliance, you're going to, kind of hit the 75+% of a lot of the other standards. Now, that isn't always the case, but in my opinion, this is a very good one to walk through. So definitely highly recommend looking into the NIST cybersecurity framework, implementing your infrastructure or your systems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about BurstIQ and what we have done with blockchain and with putting together a lot of our security techniques. So, what does blockchain really solve? It's really, taking out the man in the middle. So traditional, let's just say a banker in the today sense, the trust broker. You're transferring money from myself to say Dallas. Traditionally, I would send money. There would be a banker in the middle that would be my trust broker, and then the money would go to him. Blockchains really changed that sense and really moved the man in the middle and made it a direct relationship. And that's a very high level overview, but that's kind of the big thing that blockchain has solved. I mean, there's other aspects to this as well, but this is kind of the big thing that blockchain has solved. Some of the values, really the big point is, like I talked about, there's no single point of control. So you're really moving the broker or the trust to the internet. So there's no single point of control. You're distributing it across, thousands or millions of systems that, there's no way to take over just the one broker. And then another big one is you're incentivizing a lot of people. So now you can incentivize not necessarily the broker as the bank here, you can incentivize people for either sharing data or transferring data, and then it opens up a whole nother economic model. From a security, privacy, and rights perspective, it's really adding the immutable ledger to the whole foundation, as well as being able to see out how data is transferred and making sure that the data is transferred from one location to another in a secure and meaningful way. So what does that mean? You're being able to know that if I send data from myself to Dallas, that I know that in the sense that, it is me who is initiating the transfer, and it is Dallas actually receiving the transfer. And again, it's not going through that, broker. It's actually being a direct transfer, but not being able to solve that sense. So there's obviously a lot of healthcare applications that we think can really benefit. I think healthcare is one of the huge things that could really benefit from blockchain. And I've listed, I'm not going to go through all these, but I've listed a lot of the different applications that we have currently running on our platform, and we really think that it could help open up doors that there's always been ways to do partial things of being able to share healthcare data in a meaningful way, being able to do analytics on data, and being able to do it in a secure method. But putting together 20 or 30 different types of applications or components to try to make this all work has always been very time consuming, expensive, and actually very, very difficult. We believe we've really solved that, bringing together blockchain and security, being able to basically have one product that allows you to open up doors to build applications, to do things that you haven't been able to do in the past. So what is BurstIQ? BurstIQ is a global data network that enables identity health to be securely connected and trusted at scale. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of what we did. So BurstIQ is basically a platform that we have taken blockchain technologies, a lot of our years and years of experience in security, and build a platform that enables a lot of different features that, again, you haven't had in the past. We've created a simple integration layer. So if CRUD operations, REST API, you're able to easily hook up into our platform and have all the great blockchain security features that we've enabled in the back end, and not necessarily have to know blockchain specific tasks. So it's not like you're going to have to go learn Ethereum type of calls or blockchain type of calls. I mean, you have to know some of the methods as far as knowing what an immutable ledger is. You need to know how consenting works and some other things, but you don't have to know the specific languages of the different blockchain technologies. We've basically became kind of the man in the middle of that, and opened up our APIs that allow you to do simple REST and API calls. So again, the applications that I talked about on front, all of those are very simple to plug in to our platform. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dallas, who's kind of go over some of the trends and stuff that's in the news as far as for security sense, and he'll kind of give you an overview of what he sees as trends moving forward as well. So Dallas.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. First and foremost, I just want to say, Brian referenced sending me money, and I think everybody heard that several times throughout the presentation. So I'm gonna take you up on that after we're done here, Brian.
That sounds great.
All right. Like you're controlling, right? There you go. All right, so first and foremost, what I wanted to cover is the SolarWinds Orion hack. Now, this has pretty much dominated the headlines here in the last few months, and honestly, with good reason. The SolarWinds attack was initially discovered in December 2020, and it's important because SolarWinds is actually an IT management software. So what that means is it has access to a little bit of everything in your environment. It's also the type of software that, if your antivirus or your SIM or anything like that actually threw up a bunch of alerts, you would say, oh, well, whitelist this and don't worry about it. So of course, because of that nature of it, it did go on for several months, if not even longer. We've seen multiple adversaries that are part of that. Now, SolarWinds is what's known as a supply chain attack. And so what that means is that whoever's attacking SolarWinds isn't necessarily going after SolarWinds as the end game. What they're trying to do is they're going after SolarWinds to get to SolarWinds customers. And so you may say, well, who would actually be a customer of this company that gets hacked like this? Well, 400 of the Fortune 500 companies are all SolarWinds customers. You'll see a few of the names there you might recognize, from Cisco to Intel to NVIDIA to Microsoft. Microsoft even lost some source code out of the entire thing, or had some unauthorized access to source code. Now, it didn't just stop at the private sector. Also, the US government, the Department of Treasury, Commerce, State, the list goes on as far as who was actually affected in the government as well. Next slide, Brian. So, so first and foremost, this frog's kind of my spirit animal when it comes to cybersecurity. But really what it comes down to is, a lot of people say, okay, these companies, the government, they are spending millions, if not billions of dollars on cybersecurity. What chance does anybody else have? Well, really, don't throw in the towel. There are some simple things that we can do. This was a very, very sophisticated attack as far as SolarWinds goes. So, that's not the norm. The SolarWinds attack, we're going to be talking about probably for the rest of my career, honestly. It's that big of a deal. So, don't just think of it as, this is the norm, because it is definitely not. Recognize context. Not everybody is a Fortune 500 company. Not everybody is the US government. So just realize that, not everyone is going to get attacked and targeted quite in the same nature that they were. And then last but not least, avoid the red herrings. Now, what I mean by that is, don't look at this attack and all of a sudden start looking at everything as suspect as far as supply chain goes. I'm not saying that supply chain is not important. It absolutely is. But, a lot of people are now focusing on supply chain attacks and looking into every single vendor that they work with. Meanwhile, over here, they have systems that are unpatched. They have a MRI machine that's running XP. They're not doing vulnerability management. So, just don't get too enthralled in the supply chain attack. Like I said, very important, but, it is definitely up the scale, I guess, as far as attackers and how deep you'll get targeted by a supply chain attack like it. Next slide, Brian. All right, so what are some things that we should be looking at? Well, number one, obviously ransomware. Ransomware has been with us for a while. Ransomware is going to be with us for a very, very long time. I would actually call it public enemy number one. It's kind of the worst thing and the best thing to ever happen to cybersecurity, because it's devilishly difficult to keep out, but at the same time, you have to do something about it. Everybody knows someone that was affected by ransomware at some point. And so definitely a big deal. Now, these, all of the highlights or the headlines from this particular page are actually all in the last week. So just something to think about, that ransomware really is affecting everybody and anybody at this point. So definitely keep it at the top of the mind as you go through some of the things. And like I said, don't focus on the red herrings, the supply chain attacks and things like that. Make sure that you're actually protecting against real world events, or what's most likely anyway. Next slide, Brian. So how big is ransomware, or how important is it to secure against? Look no further than CISA and the FBI actually released a joint alert October of last year, stating that ransomware is specifically targeting healthcare and the public sectors. Now, I have a couple of links down there at the bottom. The one for the CISA.gov actually gives a great overview of what they're seeing, including IOC's indicators of compromise for attacks, whether that's domain names, IP addresses, you name it. Now, the second link that I have actually on that page is from the abuse.ch website. It's a way that is used to track command and control information, so IP addresses and things like that that are tied to different ransomware gangs and strains. And so, as you're going through that CISA.gov, if you're reading through that particular alert, you'll notice that some of the IPs, maybe your systems are not blocking or that you're not, doing anything with them. Well, it's because those IP addresses are no longer used for C2, for command and control. So, definitely take a look at that abuse.ch website instead. It's far more up to date. They update it literally every few minutes. So you can definitely see if any of your systems are communicating with known bad IP addresses and things of that nature. Next slide, Brian. Now, the kicker really in all of these attacks and all of these attackers is, it used to be a few years ago that you could really pigeonhole things and say, this is, Russia, this is nation state, this is organized crime. We're finding a lot of those attacks are blurring at this point. It's really hard to attribute, who's doing what. They're using a lot of the same techniques. Obviously, there's still indicators as far as, who kind of prefers what techniques, but, we're definitely seeing a lot of similarities between them. Now, targeted or target of opportunity. And so I was actually just talking to Brian last week about a multinational ransomware incident that I was fortunate to be a part of. And, originally, billion-dollar company, several continents, appeared to be, more or less a targeted attack. And long story short, after, a few hours of investigation, they were ransomware, and we thought, well, somebody's going after a big company here. After a few hours of investigation, I actually found out that they had a firewall at one of their locations that still had a vulnerability from 2018, and it was leaking usernames and passwords. Well, if you're not using two-factor, you're not doing really the basics, the cyber hygiene. Someone was then able to go into that environment and ransomware it. I mean, in a matter of hours, they'd be able to do that. I'm sure the attackers kind of stuck around for a bit just to kind of figure out the lay of the land, but it really was that easy. So, going back to that target or target of opportunity, obviously, if you have a firewall with a 2018 vulnerability, consider yourself a target of opportunity instead. So really, where is the weak link? If you're not doing vulnerability management, that's going to be a good chance to be your weak link. We're going to talk about it here in a little bit, but if you're not doing training for employees, definitely those are going to be weak links. And so keep in mind that, some of these attacks, ransomware, crypto miners, botnets, data exfiltration, a few years ago, once again, ransomware, it infected your machine, and within a few seconds, it popped up on the screen and said, hey, you need to pay me in Bitcoin, otherwise, you're not going to get your data back. Well, now, attackers are, going in, seeing if there's anything that they can get out of the environment. They're possibly doing data exfiltration, most likely they are, and then turning around and doing ransomware at a later date and time to the entire environment. So, definitely the attackers are starting to use these different components and kind of mix and match. And if they feel like, this company may not necessarily be worthwhile to ransomware, well, maybe they turn over, a crypto miner or something like that that's sitting there mining, not necessarily Bitcoin, but Monero or one of the other cryptocurrencies on your behalf, and just utilizing, your system resources and power. Or, once again, the botnets where they're able to do DDoS attacks against somebody else. Now, going back with our healthcare theme and my experience with healthcare, Brian kind of mentioned that the numbers are all over the place as far as, how valuable is healthcare data. And obviously it changes just like anything, but, 7 to 10 times is kind of the general statement that I seen, and even in my past research actually saw. And I mean, really, it makes sense to highlight, kind of what Brian was saying before. If somebody gets a healthcare record, they now have everything they need to do, you know, some sort of pharmaceutical fraud, you know, prescription fraud, insurance fraud. I mean, all these different aspects that you can now do just because you have all of that information. Financial, you know, if I say buy a credit card or something like that on the dark web, I mean, there's a chance that I don't even get to use it one time before the credit card company's blocking it. I mean, they have become exceptionally good at, you know, stopping fraud attempts. I mean, everybody here on this webcast has probably had that at some point in time. So, I mean, they are very, very good. But, you know, what's the end goal, or what's the end game for them? I mean, if something happens on your credit card, they send you a new credit card, you go on with life. It you know, maybe makes for a bad 15 minutes or maybe a few hours of your life, versus, you know, somebody gets your medical information. I mean, you can really, really destroy someone's life in pretty short order with that type of info. Next slide, Brian. All right, so a few things on why we are failing, or at least why I believe we're failing. And it really comes down to, you know, just a misperception of what cybersecurity really is. A lot of people say, well, cybersecurity, we have antivirus, we have firewalls. You know, the one I constantly hear is, you know, we've never had an issue before. Well, why would we do anything different? Well, you know, the thing is that things change. If you haven't been hit before, consider yourself lucky. Go buy a lottery ticket. You know, don't just assume that you're doing all the things right just because you know, you've never been hit before, or it worked last year, whatever you were doing. Compliance and regulations. You know, a lot of people say, oh, well, I'm PCI compliant, I'm HIPAA compliant, you know, or any one of those. And really, you know, compliance isn't security. Security is not compliance. So, you know, that's just very important to keep in mind that, you know, while the two may be friends, they're not exactly one and the same. So just keep that in mind. The one that I always like to highlight and talk about is the policies and procedures. You know, a lot of people say, well, we have, you know, some fantastic policies and procedures here. You know, that's great. I mean, that is such a small part of cybersecurity. You know, it's just not worth even, you know, kind of what you're doing with it. And I mean, the example that I would use is, you know, I have never, ever heard a story of a hacker rifling through a network and getting to, you know, some HR documents of policies and procedures and walking away from the table going, you know what, that's a really solid set of policies and procedures. I'm out of here. You know, it's just not there. So, I mean, obviously they're important to have, they're important to follow, but it's really for the people that follow the rules, not the people that could care less about your rules. Next slide, Brian. And so really it comes down to, you know, the keep it simple, stupid principle. You know, don't wing it. Find a standard and make a plan off of that standard. I don't even care what that standard is. Like Brian had mentioned before, there are a ton of them. You know, find one, go with it. It doesn't matter. You know, I highlight NIST there just because it is kind of the what a lot of folks have been doing, especially for the last few years. I'm like Brian as well. I see a lot of these standards really kind of coming together to where they're kind of asking the same thing. And so that kind of, you know, segues right into the critical security controls, which is from the Center for Internet Security. And they actually have a mappings document. So if you're not familiar with critical security controls, it's 20 controls. You know, starts off with, you know, knowing what's on your network. Number 2 is knowing what's on your systems. And obviously it breaks down even further into that, but they have a mappings document. And I don't see, is that link actually on there? Maybe I don't see it. But there's actually a mappings document. It's actually from Audit Scripts, the website. And the importance of that mappings document is now you can actually see, you can work towards the critical security controls, and you can see how those map to NIST. You can see how those map to, say, PCI. You can see how they map to HIPAA. And so, I mean, every organization pretty much, you know, if you are bound to high tech, HIPAA, anything like that, there's a good chance that you also have to do, you know, credit card compliance, payment card industry, PCI. So rather than working towards both of those, why not, you know, work towards the critical security controls, and you once again have those mappings that kind of cover both of them. Cyber hygiene, you know, the basics, at the end of the day, the basics still work. You know, going back to the critical security controls, they have not changed by and large. I mean, obviously the individual components under those do, but the basics just work. You know, there's no point in going and buying the next UNSIM solution or whatever everybody's calling it these days. You know, if you don't have the basics, you know, it's just like I was talking about before. If you're not doing vulnerability management, if you're not doing, you know, training, if you're not doing some of those basic things, then you really don't need to worry about the next supply chain attack, because you're bound to get hit with something else anyway. So it doesn't really matter. The prevention versus detection is a conversation I absolutely love having with customers. And it comes under the premise that, you know, yes, you have preventative controls. You have, say, antivirus, and I don't care if your antivirus is traditional antivirus, if it's next gen, if it's next gen, whatever it is. You know, if you are not taking detections, if you are not taking information from that, you're absolutely missing out on just, I mean, complete gold for information to really kind of correlate all of your events together. And so the example that I would use for that is, you know, say you have an antivirus and it blocks, you know, 10 things in a row. You know, some attackers trying to get on your system, they have mimikatz, whatever they're trying to use, and the antivirus just keeps blocking it, keeps blocking it, keeps blocking it. The 11th attempt, they get through. Well, if nobody's there to really investigate those prior 10, then, I mean, what was the point? You know, you really should have all of those come into, you know, some sort of alerting system where you can come back and look at that. And keep in mind, a lot of people just kind of assume that antivirus is, you know, a preventative control. You set it up and you walk away, and if it does its job, it does its job. But, you know, as I was just mentioning, you can use that absolutely as part of your detective mechanism as well. Same goes for firewall. You know, if you're looking at events off a firewall, if it's doing blocks, you know, there's a good possibility that an attacker is not going to be perfect. They're going to make some stumbles along the way. And if, say, some packets hit the firewall and you're now alerting on some of those blocks, you've now turned that preventative control into a detective control as well. And really that dovetails into the discussion on continuous monitoring. You know, there is nothing about security these days that is set and forget. I would argue there probably never was. But you absolutely need to be doing some sort of continuous monitoring to where all of these events, all of this information is coming together and you're looking at it. You know, it doesn't make any sense to gather all this information and, you know, set it by the sidelines. You actually have to have somebody or something looking through those and looking for interesting events or interesting anomalies. Last but not least, and goes back to that continuous monitoring piece to some degree, is attackers adapt. They're constantly changing. So should you. If you have a SolarWinds type of attack, you know, you don't necessarily need to say, oh, well, we don't have SolarWinds, so, you know, that doesn't really affect us. And so my conversation with customers, even who did not have SolarWinds, was, that's fantastic. Let's look at SolarWinds. And they said, well, why are we looking at SolarWinds? Well, What about some of the DNS queries? Microsoft and those folks, they found out that, some of the DNS queries, the initial ones that gained the foothold were 7, 8 months back. Can you tell me whether you have DNS queries and replies from 7, 8 months back? Oh, well, no, we only keep it for 2 months. Well, apparently you can get something out of the SolarWinds attack, even if you didn't necessarily get hit with it. So, just keep that in mind as the attacks change, as the attackers change, keep an open mind and don't just say, well, we don't use that product, it's no big deal. There's always something that can be gleaned from some of that information. And there is some absolutely fantastic information, from the FBI, the InfraGard, CISA. A lot of those places are putting out tons and tons and tons of information, and it just requires a little bit of skill level and some knowledgeable folks to really distill it and be able to bring it back to where it can work for you, even if, like I said, you're not using those applications or that software. Next slide, Brian. All right, so this is my freebie for the day. Going back to the basics, talk about training, and this is also critical security control number 17 if you're following along at home. So the critical security controls, as I mentioned, I used it as actually part of our framework for developing a cybersecurity platform for small businesses. And so as we were going through, the full gamut, got to number 17. And said, well, you know what, I'm going to find something from CISA, from DHS, or one of these entities that is a solid training that we can, kind of put the rubber stamp on and say, hey, if you need training, if BurstIQ needs training, here's what you guys need to do. And unfortunately, we looked and looked and looked, and there was nothing out there. So instead, what we did is came up with our own. We got feedback literally from around the world, from tons and tons and tons, probably 100 plus IT and information security experts. We presented it in the public, took feedback from people that actually saw that or went through the training, and we then turned around and released it for anybody. And so we released that back in September 2019. It got downloaded in over 150 countries. It's now been downloaded over 10,000 times, and it is a legit free cybersecurity awareness slide deck. There's no freemium, there's no signups, there's nothing. You can go download it, make it your own, teach it in your own community, at your co-working space, whatever the case may be. It's been shared and recommended at numerous conferences by numerous professionals. That happened to be one that was at the RSA conference in February of last year. So just really proud of our team for putting that together and really providing it back to the community and the world. So if you ever go through that, or you need help or have questions, by all means, reach out to us. We love feedback and improving it for everyone else. Next slide, Brian. I think actually, was that the last one, maybe?
Yeah, that was it. So Frank, back to you.
Well, I think we have time for a couple questions for sure. And I have a few myself. If anybody out in the audience has any, feel free to stick them in the chat channel, and we'll make sure Brian and Dallas address them. Brian, you talked about, you mentioned, the SOC 2 Type 2 audits. Can you give everybody in the audience an idea what it takes to achieve that level of certification? Is this something I start next week, I'm good to go? What does that all entail?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the SOC 2 Type 2, there's two different types, the Type 1 and Type 2. It's fairly informed, and it's not something that you can just go do next week. So the process that we go through is, well, one is you obviously have to have all your rules and regulations in place. So let's just say, today is the starting date. You basically go through an entire year where you're following your rules and policies. And then come next year, your accredited auditor will come in and actually go through all of your policies and procedures and basically make sure that you have followed them for the entire year. So, they'll pick subsets of your policies and say, okay, well, it says here that, you review firewall logs weekly. So show me evidence that you do that weekly. And then they'll pick other sections that say, well, it says here that your password complexity is, 20 characters, prove it. And again, there's this follow down the line of going through your policies and procedures, and they'll pick specific things out. It's kind of one of those things where, HIPAA in general gives you a lot of, it gives you, kind of the, not necessarily rules, but, kind of how you should do things. So you have to determine exactly the specific policies and procedures that you want to create. So being able to pass one of these, you have to find kind of the middle place where you're secure. Again, it kind of is like, keep it simple, as Dallas was saying, is you have to find the controls in place that make it, secure enough, but not so overly secure that you'll never pass it. So when they come in and it says that like I'll give you the firewall rule example, if it says that you review firewall rules like monthly or weekly, you have to prove that. But if you say that you do it, every hour, and then, but you only do it every week, then, that could be a red flag in the audit. So, you have to make sure that when you write your policies and procedures that you're doing it in a way that is secure, but also it makes you can actually still run your business. But it's a fairly complex path to get through it. And it's basically your process to go through. And once you've passed for the first year, you start the whole process over again. So right now we are in the 2021 year. So then we'll go through the whole audit at the end of the year, and they will basically review all of our stuff for the whole 2021 year, and then on and on and on. So that's why we keep saying that, security is an ongoing thing, and you always want to improve and update and keep moving forward.
So if I was going to put it in perspective, I would say something like HIPAA gives you the general guidelines of what you should be doing to be compliant for healthcare data. And then when you construct the policies is how you're going about meeting those requirements. And then kind of that lower level, I know you mentioned the NIST standards are kind of the control mechanisms and the frameworks you put in place to actually execute against those. Is that a fair summary of that?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. I mean, HIPAA gives you your guidelines. And again, like we said, we use NIST as far as, they put a lot of the, recommendations as far as the rules that, you should do. So, but what you said is absolutely correct.
Hey, so Dallas, I want to go back to the ransomware slide. I mean, you hit that pretty well. And I know that's been a huge problems. And thanks a lot for the SolarWinds, because I think SolarWinds is a lot of basic hygiene that you talked about as well, besides being a pretty sophisticated attack. But how do most organizations or even individuals get infected with ransomware? What are some of the techniques these bad people use to kind of propagate this kind of thing?
Yeah, great question. And really it comes down to, I guess at the end of the day, you don't want to be the low-hanging fruit. Ransomware can actually have a lot of different entry points, whether it's the firewall vulnerability, like I had talked about. Frequently, it's a phishing email of some sort into an organization. It can come a myriad of ways, but really it goes back to that prevention versus detection. If you can't just assume that your firewall is kind of this hard shell, and then you're going to, have this gooey center type of thing that's your network. You can't trust everything that's on there. And so really, you need to make sure that, if say your machine, Frank, is on the network and it's now trying to do, say, a scan across the network to figure out what else is there, is that normal? Probably not. If your machine's scanning the rest of the network, that would definitely be considered an anomaly. So just a matter of having some honey pots or something like that kind of detects some of those activities would go a long ways. But really, it comes down to that detective versus prevent. You can't prevent everything. So instead, you have to detect. That's also why we go back to, security in layers and defense in depth. to really make sure, and I mean, at the end of the day, nothing's 100%, but there's definitely a lot of things that you can do before you get to 100% for sure.
Yeah. I think this is where I interject, those of you that have kids, Shrek's best quote about ogres. And I think security is the same way. It's onions, it's layers. Security needs layers. And I think you hit that really well. Thank you. So, hey, Brian, I want to go back to some of the things we do actually at BurstIQ. A lot of folks that use blockchain say blockchain really shouldn't be used to store any data, and really use these techniques to, store data off chain and reference it on the chain with hashes. You mind giving us your opinion about that technique and a little bit of what we do at BurstIQ that's different?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great one. So, a lot of the blockchain healthcare or even any blockchain data companies, kind of evolved from the beginning of basically creating data off chain. So just having your traditional SQL or NoSQL database, and then you have a whole other component of software where you're basically, taking the hash value of the data and storing that in a ledger. I've kind of whiteboarded and walked through, several ways where, you can always circumvent that, when you're storing the data off chain. So there's a trial of troves of issues and concerns, at least in my opinion, of storing the data off chain. There's so many different ways to bypass it. Where we're a little different is we're actually storing all data on chain. We basically think of a kind of a traditional NoSQL database, but running in a blockchain ledger. What that allows us to do is actually keep individual data parts and components as far as putting security mechanisms on each individual data set. And you don't run into the issues where you have data off chain, hash values. It allows us to do joins of tables in a blockchain method. I mean, it opens up basically think of just a traditional database and all the things that you can do on it, but actually having all of the features that blockchain enables, where it's disparate data sets, consent. It allows you to have an immutable ledger. And then we've wrapped around security on top of that. So, I mean, blockchain in general is open and insecure. So, going and putting data out on a public blockchain, obviously healthcare data would be a big no-no because all that data would be completely open and available. So, our component is a private blockchain nodes, but we've also, a lot of our secret sauce is how we've enveloped and wrapped our security mechanisms around the blockchain technology. So it opens up all sorts of opportunities again that and allows you to basically scale, infinitely horizontally, and with a lot of complexity. So I just think that's kind of what sets us apart from a lot of the traditional, off-chain hash type companies.
Okay, I think we're right at time because I have a bunch more questions and we'd probably go on for another hour. But I'm going to give another shout out to Dallas and his training deck. We're going to make that available to everybody who participated in today's webinar. You should see a link to that. Please pass it around. It's an incredible resource for you and your organizations. Nothing beats awareness from everybody in a company when it comes to security and protecting your own privacy, actually. So one plug for our next, for session 3 of our Burst Knowledge, our Knowledge Burst series, is the future of your digital self. We're going to talk a lot about, in this next iteration, digital identity and what does that mean? And not just a digital identity, but a distributed digital identity. And a very hot topic of health passports, particularly as the COVID vaccine is being distributed around the world, and our underlying structures of life graphs and how we enable both privacy and data sharing across a variety of applications. So I hope to see you next time. We'll be sending out an update with the date once we get it scheduled, but it'll be the first part of March. And in the meantime, please be well and stay safe. Have a great day.